On the afternoon of Sunday, May the 18th, 1941, a young woman was getting herself ready to meet her friends and colleagues over at the nearby Salvation Army. Unfortunately for that young lady, her day would end in tragedy. This is the story of Margaret Ellen Knight. So who was Margaret Ellen Knight? Well, Margaret was born on the 10th of May 1913 to parents Christopher and Agnes Knight. She was just one of 4 children. She lived at number 609 Market Street in Whitworth, and it is in Whitworth and Whitworth Cemetery, where we are today, where this story takes us. Now, it was on the 18th of May 1941 when this story truly takes place. Margaret had been seeing a young man, a 30-year-old man by the name of John Smith, and he lived at number 44 Back Market Street, again in Whitworth, so not too far from each other. Now, on the afternoon of the 18th of May, Margaret was getting herself ready. She had a new light green coloured coat with big buttons, she had a beret, she was doing her hair up. Now, she would meet several of her friends at the Salvation Army, which was only a matter of minutes' walk away from where she lived. But it is there where events and the story today would escalate with the loss of not 1, but 2 lives. After Margaret's father passed away from influenza in October 1918, her mother would remarry, and she married a man called Fred Holt. And this wedding occurred in October of 1936. And together they would live at number 609 Market Street. In that household there was just the mother Agnes, the stepfather Fred, and that of Margaret. From around November 1940, Margaret had begun seeing a young man by the name of John Smith. And John Smith was a cotton weaver by trade, but from all accounts, he was, and this is what the papers labelled him as, he seemed a little bit slow or a little bit backwards. Now, I'm not saying that's the right terminology today, but we are just reiterating what the newspapers at the time wrote about John Smith. But it was in December of that year when things would become more serious between the two, and it appears that John would make his way to Margaret's home, usually after her parents had retired for the evening. Now, 3 months later, and in March 1941, Margaret found herself pregnant. She would put all the onus of blame on to John. Now, John, in fairness, would try to win back the affections of Margaret. You see, Margaret at this point didn't want anything to do with John. She was infuriated that she found herself pregnant. But like I said, John, in fairness, would approach Margaret in the streets. He would try to talk to her on her own, and he would propose to her, asking for her hand in marriage. He wanted to do the right thing for Margaret and his unborn baby. Now, it was during one chance encounter in a local shop in Whitworth that Agnes, Margaret's mother, bumped into John. And Agnes at this point kind of knew things weren't right between her daughter and John Smith. So she invited John to their home to discuss the matter further. Now, when John arrived the following evening, Margaret didn't want anything to do with John. She didn't want to speak to him. But fortunately, John would manage to speak to her. He would meet her in a separate room to the one he was invited to by Agnes. Margaret was sat alone, and John went into this room and they spoke, but things got heated. Now, John left that room and Agnes asked John if everything was all right, and John simply replied, no. Now, after this encounter, this meeting at Margaret's home. Resentment, we could assume, was probably bubbling with John. After all, he had an unborn child that I think, from all accounts, he was looking forward to raising, bringing him up, or her up. Margaret wanted nothing more to do with him. So obviously you could say probably been a little bit resentful at this point and maybe angry towards Margaret, but he would still try his best to win her affections back. He met her at least twice more after the visit in March, and each time Margaret's answer to his requests of getting back together was always no. And this will bring us to Saturday the 17th of May 1941. And John, he had already signed up to the Whitworth Home Guard unit 2 weeks prior to the events taking place on the 18th. In them 2 weeks, he hardly had any training whatsoever, and especially when it comes to handling rifles. But it was on the Saturday the 17th of May that John went out with a small troop of fellow soldiers, fellow Home Guards, and he was given his uniform, he was given a rifle, and he was given, more importantly, cartridges for that rifle. Now, returning back to the headquarters at the Home Guard, the soldiers themselves, the Home Guard, had to hand over, obviously, the unspent rounds. Now, John hadn't used any at this point, but one of those cartridges was indeed missing. Now, he would be reprimanded for this because it was a serious breach, it was a serious offence, and he would be reprimanded by the lieutenants, those higher up, and he would be told that he would have to face a disciplinary in the coming days, if not the next couple of weeks, because of this, because like I said, it was so serious. Now obviously John himself appreciated the seriousness of this, and he was more than willing to face the punishment for it. It was on his return home and when he was emptying his pockets that he would find this missing cartridge. So it was on the 18th of May, which was a Sunday evening, and the actual Salvation Army meeting was being led by Mrs. Alice Shorrock, as she was the cousin of John Smith. Now, it was during that meeting that John himself would enter the building, and he sat a couple of rows behind from where Margaret was now sitting with other friends. Now, Margaret obviously had realised that John had made his way into the Salvation Army, and she was becoming a little bit uncomfortable. But she remained there until after it had all finished. Now, when Alice left the building along with Doris, who was another friend, and along with Margaret herself, all three women made their way out of the Salvation Army. Now, these women, they would begin walking up Market Street. John Smith left the Salvation Army meeting at the same time, and he caught up with Margaret, and he would ask her what she was doing with the army, or to the words to those effects. Now, Margaret turned around and said it had nothing whatsoever to do with him, which obviously angered John somewhat. Now, it seems that Margaret herself walked some distance, 20 feet or so ahead of John himself, who held back. And it's at that moment John raised the rifle and he fired off one single round. As the three ladies were making their way along Market Street, one of them, Doris Crossley, she stopped and told the girls just to wait a moment because she had to go back inside the Salvation Army to say her goodbyes to a close friend of hers. She was only in there a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, outside, John was trying his best to talk to Margaret, but she was having none of it. Now, a couple of minutes passed and Doris Crossley left the Salvation Army building, and she heard a gunshot, a rifle shot being made. She noticed Margaret slump to the ground. Horrified, Doris ran back into the Salvation Army building to fetch help. Now, outside, nearby was PC Duncan. He heard this same gunshot and he ran over to where it occurred, or where he thought he could hear it coming from. he quickly made his way to Margaret's body. He also noticed John Smith, who was now trying to flee the scene, but PC Duncan shouted over, "Stop running." John Smith did that, he actually stopped. John Smith then walked over to where PC Duncan was, who was now trying to give aid as best he could to poor Margaret. Now the body of Margaret would be lying somewhere roughly around about here. And what we're going to do, we're going to line up that shot of the old black and white police crime photo from 1941. And as you can see, you've got the old Millgate Jubilee School just here. But it's these two windows on the left which we're going to use as reference points. And if we just line it up round about here, that is where Margaret would have been laying directly after being shot by John Smith. It was just along here where the Salvation Army building once stood. But as you can see, there's absolutely nothing along this stretch anymore. All the buildings have gone. So we're going to make our way down and we'll show you guys where that building used to be. For the next shot, we're going to line up the old Salvation Army building, which we believe would have been somewhere around here in this location, simply because if we base in the distance the two sets of terraced houses just over there, and we look at the picture Vicky's got in her hand, we're going to line up those two sets of houses, terraced houses, with the ones just over there. So if we have the camera around about here, we should be able to line up, hopefully, the old picture and where the Salvation Army building once was. So I'm stood roughly where the Salvation Army once stood, and it's here where Margaret would have left that evening with a couple of her friends. Now, as she made her way along this stretch of road, this is where she would have encountered John Smith. And after a little skirmish, John Smith held back a little bit and he let Margaret and her friends, or her friend, go a few yards in front. He then lifted the rifle, not above his shoulder but slightly under, and he fired off that single shot. Margaret slumped to the ground where Vicky's now stood, and it is there where she would sadly pass away. Now, John Smith dropped the rifle and he fled, but PC Duncan, who was on hand, shouted back to John Smith to stop running, and he did, and he came back over to where Margaret was lying. PC Duncan was also still around and he came to Margaret's aid. John Smith may have been stood where I'm standing now, overlooking the body of poor Margaret. Where Vicky's stood would indeed be the actual point where Margaret was lying in that photo, and as you can see, she's actually lying across here with her arm just approaching the road itself. And it's truly tragic what happened to Margaret that evening, or that afternoon. But it is here where that event took place all those years ago, back in 1941. Now, for the final shot that we're going to do for this video, we're going to line up another crime scene photo, and in this one you will see all of the buildings going down here, and it would have been to our right hand side where again the body of Margaret was lying. And this gives a better indication as to just how times have changed, and the buildings themselves have now all gone. But you can see just in the distance the Salvation Army plus a row of houses, and we'll put arrows over where again the Salvation Army was, and obviously where the body of Margaret would be found. Now we're here in Whitworth Cemetery, or as it was known, Facet Cemetery back in the 1940s. But it's somewhere in here where the body of Margaret lies. And from what we believe, she's now buried with her mother Agnes. We believe with her stepfather Fred. But there's also a 5-year-old from 1925 who was, or is, a family relative of Fred Holt. And it's a 5-year-old boy by the name of Jim or James Holt. And where Vicky's standing, we believe is somewhere around here. We know he has a small headstone, or I should say they have a small headstone, something similar to that. So we're going to scour around. We know the headstone number is 13162. So it's just a case of going through them all again, as you can see with this one. 13262, so we're literally just 100 away. So it's just a case of looking now for that headstone. So we're going to go up and down as Vicky's just shouted over. Margaret was interred here on the 22nd of May 1941, so literally just 4 days after the shooting in Whitworth itself. And indeed, we've just checked the notes, she's interred with that of her mother and her stepfather, as well as a young boy by the name of Jim Holt. And we're just looking on the floor now. You said it's lying down, didn't you? We do have a photograph from a book written by Alan Hayhurst, and I'll put links to Amazon down below. But the photograph that this gentleman took many, many years ago shows the headstone actually lying down on the grass itself. So we're just having a look round. Vicky's just stopped at one. What have you got there, Vic?
I can't read that. I'm putting my foot on. I don't know what it is. Can you read that number? I do see JH. Where that fish is.
Let's just move this out way.
Oh,
there we go. It is it. This is the one. JH 13162. So this is where Margaret is interred. That's a good find.
So somebody must, well, somebody.
Let's have another. Yeah, let's get another shot in for our viewers. We'll tidy the grave up as well a little bit, best we can. But the final resting place, and that photograph in that book by Mr. Hayhurst is absolutely correct, and it's here, just where Margaret and her mother Agnes and Fred and the child, a 5-year-old child by the name of Jim, is interred. But again, so pleased that Vicky's managed to find this. Now a doctor was quickly called for, along with more police officers, but sadly by the time a doctor did arrive at the scene, poor Margaret had passed away. John Smith was arrested and he was taken in for questioning, and he would give a statement pretty quickly. And what we'll do, we will read that statement out so you, the viewer, can get a sense of feeling as to what was going through John's own state of mind at that time. And I'll read it out to you now. I have it on my phone, but it does give an insight into the mind of what John was thinking. And it goes like this. I fired the rifle meaning to aim over her head, meaning to frighten her, and I was horror-stricken when I saw her fall to the ground. Being so afraid, I turned and ran away. I have only been in the Home Guards about a fortnight, and up to the time of me using it to frighten Margaret, I had received no instruction regarding loading and firing, and hitting her was an accident. I am very, very sorry for what occurred, and I did not intend to kill her. There was another witness at the time of the shooting, and that was Corporal James Nightingale from the Home Guard. And after hearing the rifle shot, he himself made his way over to where Margaret was being attended to by PC Duncan. Now, John would tell, or he would speak to James Nightingale, and he would tell him how himself and Margaret were having a tiff, and he didn't mean to shoot her. He intended to frighten her by shooting the cartridge or the bullet over her head and into the air. He didn't mean to shoot Margaret. On Tuesday, 17th of June 1941, John Smith would appear at the Rochdale County Court uncharged with the murder of Margaret Knight. Now, prosecuting was a man called Mr. Riches, and he would go into detail about how John himself was dressed on the evening or the afternoon of that attack on Margaret. And this would be the prosecuting's case to prove that John himself went with suspicious reasons. Now, he would ask John Smith, why was he dressed in Home Guard attire on that afternoon? If after all, if we're to believe that John was making his way back to the headquarters to hand over the missing cartridge that he had found the evening before, he could have just dressed in normal everyday clothing, but he was dressed in the Home Guard outfit. John replied to that question saying, well, I was making my way to the headquarters, I'm going to hand over the cartridge, the rifle, as well as the clothing he was wearing. That leads to more questions. If he's changing clothing, did he have extra clothing with him? Did he have clothing at the headquarters? That I don't know. But he would tell that he was most certainly going back to the headquarters to hand over this cartridge. Mr. Riches didn't believe any of this, and he would say, no, you went dressed in that outfit, that clothing, simply to avoid suspicion from anybody else. Home Guards, they were seen pretty much routinely on the streets, not just in Whitworth, but in the United Kingdom. This was at the wartime, at the start, the early beginnings of the Second World War. So the Home Guard, people dressed in Home Guard attire, nobody batted an eyelid. So a man walking around dressed in that outfit, carrying a rifle, wouldn't have raised any suspicions. And this is what Mr. Riches put to John and to the jury. And it's quite damning. And Mr. Riches is quite right in what he was saying. He didn't have to be dressed, John Smith did not have to be dressed in that attire on the afternoon of this attack. Now, interestingly, at this hearing at the Rochdale County Court, Fred Holt, the stepfather, would take to the stand, and he was asked about what his thoughts were on John Smith, and he would say he always found him an approachable, happy young man. He would also use the words slow, seemingly backwards, which we've touched upon at the start of this video, but other than that, he was a normal, happy-go-lucky character. So, even though it's Fred Holt's stepdaughter who was killed, it was still showing a different side to John that probably the public were picturing at this point. After all, this man had taken the life of an innocent 28-year-old lady. Now, obviously, with all the evidence now being given, and you know, the witnesses had come forward and everything that we've spoken about was brought to light, John Smith will be charged with the willful murder of Margaret Knight, and he would attend the next Manchester Assizes. And that took place on the 8th of July 1941 in front of Judge Mr. Justice Hallett. Now, everything that, again, like I said, that we've just touched upon, you know, the movements prior to the shooting of Margaret, the lead up to it, the relationship John and Margaret had before, obviously, May 1941, and how happy-go-lucky they both were and seemingly in love they were, all that came out. Now, the jury, after 5.5 hours of evidence being given, after everything was brought to light, the jury would only take 16 minutes or so to come to a guilty verdict of murder. And they came back into the waiting courtroom with this verdict, but they also would say to Mr. Justice Hallett that they would recommend mercy, a strong recommendation for mercy. Obviously the judge had her job to do, and because the verdict of murder had come through, he donned the black cap, as was customary, and he would hand down the death sentence to John Smith. Now, within minutes, John's own solicitor, he came out and he would tell the journalists that he would be making appeal against this verdict. On the 12th of July, the appeal was set in earnest by Mr. A.S. Coop. He was the solicitor acting on behalf of John Smith. However, on the 20th of August of the same year, this appeal was dismissed at the Court of Criminal Appeal. The appeal itself was based on misdirection by the original judge, Mr. Justice Hallett. You see, people thought that Mr. Hallett had misdirected the jury by his summoning up, and that all the evidence pointed to John Smith himself knowing full well what he was planning to do and obviously how he did it, the murder of Margaret. The missing cartridge, the judge would imply that John himself knew all along he had this cartridge. He had simply just hid it away and not returned it to the headquarters. This nonsense about him losing it, the justice, or Mr. Justice Hallett, did not believe. The appeal failed on the 20th of August, and John Smith, he would therefore be sentenced to hang on the 4th of September 1941, and Thomas Pierrepoint would be his executioner. Interestingly, it was at the Manchester Assizes where John Smith's drill sergeant from the Home Guard would perhaps play a big role in all of this, in that he would testify that John Smith was perhaps the worst shot he had ever seen. In other words, John Smith did not know how to fire a rifle. He didn't know how to handle a rifle. So this will back up John Smith's own words in his own testimony, in his own witness testimony, that he only had literally 2 weeks whilst at the Home Guard. But yet in them 2 weeks, he literally had 30 minutes of practice with a rifle, 30 minutes in a 2-week period. His own drill sergeant would admit that John Smith was one of the worst shots he had ever come across. So this will back up John Smith when he said he was trying to aim into the air and to scare Margaret. He didn't want to shoot Margaret, he just simply wanted to frighten her. Now obviously the shot was that accurate, it went through Margaret's back just above the waistline. The bullet penetrated the back and exited through the stomach. The bullet wound itself, the trajectory of the missile, of the bullet, was directly in line, and obviously in line of their unborn baby. Now the jury themselves would have had to see photographs, which they did. There were at least 2 photographs that the jury were shown. One showed the back of Margaret's body with the entrance hole, the wound, which was quite small. However, more graphically, they would have been shown the front of her body, the stomach, and the hole would have been a lot bigger. And it wouldn't have gone amiss of the jury to realise that the unborn baby obviously was killed along with the mother, Margaret. So this would have been shocking as well. Maybe this was also the reason why they found John Smith guilty of murder and not manslaughter, as Mr. A.S. Coop thought he should have been found guilty of. We don't know, but most certainly they would have seen photographs of the destruction, the poor lifeless body of Margaret, and it wouldn't gone amiss that there was also a second killing, and that of the unborn child. Just like with all other executed criminals at Strangeways Prison, John Smith's body will be interred within the grounds of the prison itself, and in the 1990s his body, along with many other executed criminals, would be dug up and taken over to Blackley Crematorium, where his body would be cremated and the ashes placed in one of 2 plots. The story itself, it's a needless one, as is many stories that we've covered. But tell us your thoughts down below. John Smith would always maintain his innocence in this one and say that he only intended to frighten Margaret by firing that cartridge, that bullet, over her head and into the air. He was a bad shot, his drill sergeant would testify in court. John Smith always maintained he didn't mean to do it. However, when you look at the actual case file itself and the prosecuting by Mr. Riches, who actually would grill John Smith on why he was wearing the Home Guard outfit when he didn't need to on Sunday the 18th, that would come back, and I think that was quite damning. In John, like I said, he couldn't really answer it. I mean, if he'd had worn normal casual wear, chances are he may have just got manslaughter and not charged of murder. Chances are he may have got manslaughter and had to do penal servitude, hard labour. But instead, he was found guilty of the willful murder of Margaret, and he would face the ultimate punishment. He would die by execution, by hanging in Strangeways Prison. Tell us your thoughts down below. Do you think John Smith knew full well what he was doing by firing this cartridge towards Margaret? Had he planned to take the life of Margaret, or was he just simply trying to frighten her? It would be interesting to know your thoughts. Now, as we bring this story to an end, like we're going to do in most videos going ahead, we're going to have a bit of a debrief, myself and Vicky, and put our thoughts. I personally agree with Vicky with this one. We've spoken off camera. I personally don't believe John Smith himself intended to shoot Margaret.
No.
I believe, because we've mentioned, and I don't like using this terminology, but it's what was in the papers, but he was reported to have been quite slow and backwards in his demeanour. I think he just dressed in the Home Guard outfit, and he was indeed making his way to the Home Guard headquarters to hand over the rifle and the cartridge. He admitted in court at the Manchester Assizes, which I didn't really mention upon during the video, but he would actually say that he only put the cartridge in the rifle whilst he was sat in the actual Salvation Army building and sat behind Margaret. It was only then he got the idea to put the cartridge in, to fire it into the air, to scare, to frighten Margaret. That was the only time he thought about doing what he did. Now, Vicky's got a point about him being slow or backward, and again, we don't like using the phrase, but we are trying to just keep it real with the terminology used at the time.
I don't think he meant to do it, but I'm a big believer of a life for a life, and the fact in this case he actually took 2. It is classed as a life at 5 months. Yeah, I mean,
Margaret was pregnant. She was 5 months pregnant,
and he knew that.
And he did know she was pregnant.
And he also knew who was a bad shot.
Yeah, but I mean, this is it. I mean, also the bad shot element. Even the drill sergeant tried to back up John Smith's claims of the lack of training for a start and how he was such a bad shot. Now, we know that John Smith, he put the rifle just slightly below his shoulder, so he never had the rifle pointing upwards. He was pointing it directly. So, I mean, I know it sounds graphic and it sounds a bit insensitive, but in the end it wasn't such a bad shot, was it? No. Because the bullet went straight through poor Margaret's back, just above the waist, and it exited through the stomach at the same height of where the unborn baby would obviously have been. But like I say, I'm sure the jury themselves would have taken this on board, and I think it's the unborn baby element which perhaps swayed them.
Yeah, for me it is.
Yeah.
If there wasn't a baby involved,
he may have got manslaughter.
It's still a life for a life.
Yeah.
Oh, that's me. I've always been life for a life.
So tell us your thoughts down below. Should John Smith have hung for not taking 1 life, but obviously ultimately taking 2 lives? It'd be interesting to know your thoughts down below on this one.
But I don't think he did go out to plan to kill her. I don't think he went out that day.
Yeah, I mean, I will give him the benefit of the doubt, and I believe he did only plan to do it. Well, not do it, but shoot the rifle whilst they were in the Salvation Army. Like he said, he put the cartridge in the rifle whilst he was sat in one of the pews in the actual building. That's when I actually do. I might be being naive, but I believe that is probably what occurred. Whether or not he intended to aim above her head is another story. Perhaps at that point he did intend to shoot her when he was outside.
But let's be honest, if he was such a terrible shot, should he have been allowed to take that home with him?
This is another issue. I mean, he had literally 30 minutes training with a gun on this Saturday, the day before. Before that, he'd only been in the Home Guard for around 2 weeks, around about 2 weeks, no training whatsoever. But he was allowed to carry live cartridges as well as obviously the rifle around with him, which is bizarre, because I'd have thought on the Saturday when he returned back to the headquarters, when he handed over the cartridges he did have, minus the missing one, would he have not been made to hand over the rifle at that point? This is what I can't get my head around. If anybody knows more about the history of Home Guard and things like that, let us know down below. Why was John Smith allowed to take the rifle home with him? And especially when they knew he had a missing cartridge. Yeah. Surely they should have took the rifle off him even because of the missing cartridge.
Yeah.
Alarm bells should have been ringing perhaps back then. Tell us your thoughts down below on that. It's an interesting one, and we would love to know what people's feelings are on this one, because like Vicky said, a life for a life, but he did take 2 lives at the end of the day. Let us know your thoughts down below. Now, as we leave Whitworth Cemetery behind us, comment down below if you've heard this story, the story of Margaret Knight and John Smith here in Whitworth. If you have, what are your thoughts? Should John Smith have hung for the crime he committed back in May 1941? Or perhaps he should have been charged with manslaughter and therefore perhaps spend more time or a lifetime imprisonment? It would be interesting to know your thoughts. Also, if you could, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you can you please share this video on any social platform that you may use? It really does help myself and Vicky tremendously. We never take it for granted, and we do appreciate the support that all you kind folk continuously give to us. But in the meantime, guys, as I always say, we want you to take care, look after yourselves, always stay safe but stay curious, and we will be back soon with more tales from a dark but at times glorious past. Take care, everybody.